You lie awake at 3 a.m. replaying that conversation with your boss, that relationship that ended, or that opportunity you lost, unable to release the grip these thoughts have on your peace of mind. Every setback feels personal, every criticism cuts deep, and you find yourself clinging to outcomes you cannot control while your mental energy drains away on things that have already happened or may never come to pass. I am Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor who ruled the most powerful empire in history while battling plagues, wars, and betrayals that would break lesser men. For nearly 2 decades, I governed millions of lives while maintaining inner peace through the Stoic art of letting go, not through indifference, but through a profound understanding of what truly deserves our attachment. The Stoic principles I'll share will transform how you handle disappointment, criticism, and the inevitable losses that life brings your way. What sustained me through the collapse of armies and the death of loved ones can free you from the mental prison of clinging to what you cannot control. The same philosophy that allowed me to find tranquility while bearing the weight of an empire can teach you to release your grip on outcomes and find peace in the present moment. But first, like this video, subscribe for more Stoic wisdom that has guided leaders for 2 millennia, and comment where you're watching from. I want to see how far the need for inner freedom has spread across our modern world. I never sought the purple cloak of empire. When Antoninus Pius adopted me as his son and heir, I was a young man more interested in philosophy than politics, more drawn to the quiet contemplation of Stoic principles than the thunderous demands of ruling millions. Yet fate, that force beyond all human control, had other plans for my life. The weight of absolute power settled on my shoulders like a mountain I could never set down. Every decision I made rippled across the known world, affecting lives I would never see, determining fates I could never fully comprehend. In those early days of my reign, I discovered my first profound lesson in the necessity of letting go. The illusion that power grants control. The Antonine Plague arrived in the 2nd year of my rule, like a divine test of everything I thought. I understood about governance and control. It swept through our legions returning from the Parthian campaigns, then spread like wildfire through every province of our vast empire. Within months, entire cities were decimated. Reports reached me daily of mass graves being dug, of skilled craftsmen and beloved teachers dying alongside slaves and soldiers. I remember standing in my private study, surrounded by scrolls bearing the death counts from Alexandria, from Gaul, from the German frontier. The numbers blurred before my eyes, not mere statistics, but lives, dreams, loves, all extinguished by an enemy I could not fight with legions or diplomacy. Here was a force that respected neither my imperial authority nor my philosophical wisdom. First instinct was to control what could not be controlled. I issued edicts, mobilized physicians, diverted grain shipments to affected areas. I worked tirelessly, sleeping little, driving myself toward exhaustion, in the desperate hope that imperial will could somehow stem the tide of death. But the plague continued its merciless advance, indifferent to my commands, immune to my power. It was during one particularly dark night, as I sat reviewing reports of mounting casualties, that the fundamental truth struck me with startling clarity. I was suffering not just from the tragedy itself, but from my attachment to an outcome I could never guarantee. My anguish came not merely from witnessing death, but from my desperate need to prevent it, to control it, to defeat it through sheer force of will. This realization became my introduction to the deepest teaching of the Stoics, that our suffering multiplies when we resist what is already happening, when we exhaust ourselves trying to control what lies beyond our influence. The plague would run its course regardless of my imperial preferences. People I cared about would die despite my love for them. The empire would face challenges that no amount of planning could prevent. But here, in this moment of apparent powerlessness, I discovered something unexpected: freedom. When I finally accepted that I could not control the plague's path, I found that I could control something far more important, my response to it. I could choose courage over panic, wisdom over desperation, service over self-pity. I began to focus my energy not on preventing every death, but on ensuring that those who survived had food, medicine, and hope. I stopped trying to control the uncontrollable and started mastering what was actually within my power, my decisions, my character, my daily commitment to virtue regardless of outcomes. This was my first true education in the art of letting go. Not letting go of responsibility or care, but letting go of the crushing weight of attachment to results beyond my influence. The empire needed an emperor who could act wisely in the face of uncertainty, not one paralyzed by the fear of imperfect outcomes. The teachings that would transform my understanding of attachment and control came to me through the words of a man who had himself mastered the art of letting go through the harshest circumstances imaginable. Epictetus had been born a slave, his very name meaning acquired one, yet he possessed a freedom of spirit that surpassed any emperor. When he spoke of liberation from suffering, he spoke from a depth of experience that no amount of privilege could provide. I first encountered his teachings as a young man, long before the weight of empire tested every principle I thought I understood. His words seemed almost impossibly simple at first. Some things are within our power, while others are not. Yet, as I would discover through years of applying this fundamental insight, the entire architecture of human happiness rests upon this single distinction. Epictetus taught that only three things are truly within our power: our judgments, our desires, and our actions. Everything else, our reputation, our health, other people's behavior, the outcomes of our efforts, even our own past and future, lies beyond our direct control. This seems obvious when stated plainly, yet I have watched countless individuals, including my former self, exhaust their lives trying to control what cannot be controlled. The plague had shown me the practical truth of this teaching, but I needed to understand its deeper implications. Why do we instinctively grasp at things beyond our control? Why does letting go feel like giving up, when it actually represents the path to genuine power? Epictetus explained that we suffer not from events themselves, but from our judgments about those events. When I received news of a military defeat, the defeat itself was neither good nor bad. It was simply what had happened. My suffering came from my judgment that it should not have happened, that a competent emperor would have prevented it, that this outcome reflected some failure of my character or leadership. But these judgments, unlike the defeat itself, were entirely within my control. I could choose to see the defeat as a catastrophe that diminished my worth, or I could see it as information that would inform better decisions in the future. I could judge it as evidence of cosmic injustice, or as an opportunity to practice resilience and learn from setbacks. This was not mere philosophical wordplay. The distinction between what we can and cannot control becomes a practical tool for allocating our mental and emotional energy. Every moment we spend feeling angry about past events is energy unavailable for shaping present circumstances. Every hour we spend worrying about outcomes beyond our influence is an hour stolen from the important work of developing our character and making wise decisions. I began to practice what Epictetus called the discipline of desire, training myself to want what happens rather than demanding that what I want should happen. This does not mean becoming passive or indifferent to outcomes. I still worked diligently to defend the empire, to govern justly, to care for those under my protection. But I learned to hold these efforts with an open hand, rather than a clenched fist. When diplomatic negotiations failed, I would remind myself that I could control the wisdom and sincerity I brought to the table, but not the other party's response. When advisors disappointed me with poor counsel, I would focus on my own discernment in choosing future advisors rather than nursing resentment about their limitations. When illness struck members of my family, I would pour my energy into providing the best care possible, while accepting that recovery was not guaranteed. This practice required constant vigilance. The mind's default mode is to attach to preferred outcomes, to resist unwanted changes, to imagine that our happiness depends on external circumstances aligning with our desires. Each day brought new opportunities to practice the discipline of desire, to catch myself in the act of grasping at the uncontrollable and gently redirect that energy toward what actually lay within my influence. Gradually, I discovered that this practice did not diminish my effectiveness as an emperor. It enhanced it. When I stopped exhausting myself with futile resistance to what had already happened, I had more energy available for responding wisely to present challenges. When I released my attachment to being seen as infallible, I became more willing to seek advice and acknowledge mistakes. When I accepted that not every problem had a perfect solution, I became better at finding workable solutions. The philosophy of release, I learned, is not about caring less. It is about caring more skillfully. It is about directing our finite capacity for concern toward the areas where it can actually make a difference, rather than dissipating it in worry about matters beyond our reach. The death of Antoninus Pius shattered my world in ways I was not prepared to understand. He had been more than an adoptive father. He was my guide through the labyrinth of imperial politics, my example of how to wield absolute power with justice and humility. When the fever took him in his 23rd year of rule, I lost not only a beloved parent, but the illusion that those we love most deeply will somehow prove exempt from mortality's claims. I had studied philosophy, understood intellectually that all things pass away, but intellectual understanding crumbles before the raw reality of personal loss. Standing beside his deathbed, watching the shallow rise and fall of his chest grow fainter with each breath, I confronted a truth that would reshape every attachment I held. Everyone I love will die, and there's nothing my power, my wisdom, or my devotion can do to prevent it. The funeral arrangements consumed weeks of my attention, but they could not consume the deeper questions his death had awakened. If the most virtuous man I knew could be claimed by death, if 23 years of exemplary rule could end in a moment, what did it mean to build a life around temporary relationships and achievements? Was love itself a form of foolishness, a voluntary enslavement to inevitable loss? In my grief, I returned to the teachings of Epictetus, seeking wisdom that could hold steady in the face of such fundamental uncertainty. His words came back to me with new urgency. Don't demand that things happen as you wish. Wish that they happen as they do happen, and you will go on well. Applied to death, this teaching seemed almost cruel. How could I wish for the death of someone I loved? But slowly, through daily meditation and painful honesty with myself, I began to understand what he meant. Wishing that Antoninus Pius could live forever was not love. It was a demand that reality conform to my preferences. True love meant accepting him completely, including his mortality. It meant cherishing our time together without the desperate need to make it permanent. This realization led me to a practice that would become central to my daily routine, memento mori, the remembrance of death. Each morning, I would spend time contemplating the mortality of everyone I cared about, my wife Faustina, my children, my closest advisors, even myself. This was not morbid dwelling on tragedy, but a deliberate cultivation of perspective that would free me from the prison of taking permanence for granted. When I truly accepted that Faustina would one day die, I found myself listening more carefully to her words, treasuring our conversations without the assumption that there would always be another chance to connect deeply. When I acknowledged that my children's childhood was fleeting, I became more present during our time together, less distracted by imperial duties that seemed urgent but were rarely truly important. The practice taught me to distinguish between attachment and love. Attachment says, I love you, therefore you must not change or leave me. Love says, I love you, therefore I will cherish you completely, while accepting that our time together is precious precisely because it is limited. Attachment grasps and demands permanence. Love appreciates and releases. Death became my teacher in the art of letting go because it showed me the ultimate futility of clinging to what must inevitably pass away. Every sunrise I witness is one of a finite number. Every conversation with a friend occurs against the backdrop of our shared mortality. Every moment of beauty or joy gains its poignancy from its transient nature. Rather than diminishing my capacity to care, this awareness deepened it. When I stopped demanding that my relationships be permanent, I became more willing to be vulnerable within them. When I accepted that my reign would eventually end, I became more focused on governing well in the present, rather than obsessing over my historical legacy. When I embraced my own mortality, I found myself more alive to each day's possibilities. The death mask they made of Antoninus Pius sits in my private chambers, not as a morbid reminder, but as a teacher. It reminds me that everything I see today, the faces of my family, the bustling streets of Rome, the territories of our empire, exists in this moment and will exist differently or not at all in moments to come. This is not cause for despair, but for profound appreciation. Through accepting death as the natural completion of life rather than its enemy, I discovered that the fear of loss had been the source of much of my suffering. When I stopped fighting the impermanence that defines all existence, I found a peace that no external change could disturb. Death taught me that letting go is not about caring less. It is about loving more fully while holding more lightly, Farts. Victory at Carnuntum should have been one of my greatest triumphs. Our legions had finally broken the Germanic tribes that had threatened our Danubian frontier for years. The enemy chieftains knelt before my tribunal, their weapons laid at my feet in submission. The soldiers cheered my name as laurel wreaths were placed upon my head, and dispatches carried news of our success back to Rome, where the Senate would vote new honors in my name. Yet, as I stood there receiving the adulation of my men, I felt something unexpected, a hollow emptiness where satisfaction should have been. The victory was complete, the threat neutralized, the empire secure. So why did I find myself already thinking about the next campaign, the next challenge, the next achievement that might finally provide the lasting contentment that this one had promised but failed to deliver? That night in my tent, surrounded by the spoils of war and the congratulations of my generals, I confronted a disturbing truth about the nature of desire itself. Getting what we want does not end our wanting. It merely shifts our focus to the next object of desire. The Germanic threat had been replaced in my mind by concerns about the Sarmatians to the east, about political challenges in Rome, about a dozen other problems that now seemed urgent, precisely because this one had been solved. This was my introduction to what the Stoics call the discipline of desire, the recognition that our happiness depends not on satisfying our wants, but on wanting what we already have. The broken victory wreath that fell from my head that evening became a symbol of something profound. Even our greatest achievements are temporary, and attaching our peace of mind to external accomplishments is a path to perpetual dissatisfaction. Began to observe this pattern everywhere in my life. When I desired the respect of the Senate, I found that earning it only made me anxious about maintaining it. When I wanted my military campaigns to succeed, success brought the burden of living up to my reputation. When I hoped for my children to excel in their studies, their achievements made me worry about their future challenges. Desire, I realized, was not a problem to be solved, but a fire to be tamed. The discipline of desire does not mean eliminating all preferences or becoming indifferent to outcomes. I still worked diligently for the empire's welfare, still hoped for my family's happiness, still preferred peace to war and health to illness. But I learned to hold these preferences lightly, as hopes rather than demands, as directions for my effort rather than conditions for my contentment. Epictetus had taught me to practice preferring what happens rather than demanding that what I prefer should happen. This seemed impossible at first. How could I prefer military defeats, political setbacks, or personal disappointments? But gradually I understood that this practice was not about convincing myself that bad outcomes were actually good, but about accepting them as opportunities to practice virtue. When diplomatic negotiations failed, instead of raging about the other party's unreasonableness, I would ask myself, how can this situation help me develop patience, wisdom, or creativity? When advisors disappointed me with poor counsel, rather than dwelling on their limitations, I would focus on how their mistakes could teach me better discernment. When illness struck members of my household, I would use the experience to practice compassion and acceptance rather than fighting uselessly against what had already occurred. This practice transformed my relationship with both success and failure. Victory became an opportunity to practice humility and gratitude rather than a validation of my worth. Defeat became a chance to develop resilience and learn from mistakes rather than evidence of personal inadequacy. Both outcomes became equally valuable as training grounds for virtue, equally temporary as experiences in the continuous flow of imperial life. I discovered that the discipline of desire worked like a form of internal economics. Every moment I spent wanting things to be different from how they were was energy unavailable for responding skillfully to how they actually were. Every hour I devoted to resenting the past or demanding guarantees about the future was time stolen. From the important work of the present moment, the practice required constant vigilance. The mind's default mode is to generate desires, to imagine that happiness lies just beyond the next achievement, the next acquisition, the next solved problem. Each day brought new opportunities to catch myself in this pattern and redirect my attention from what I wanted to happen toward what was actually happening and how I could respond with wisdom and virtue. Through this discipline, I learned that desire is not evil, but it is dangerous when we mistake it for necessity. We can want things while remembering that our peace does not depend on getting them. We can work toward goals while accepting that our worth is not determined by achieving them. We can hope for the best while preparing ourselves to respond well to whatever actually occurs. The scroll arrived during the third hour of my morning. Audiences, delivered by a nervous clerk who clearly understood its contents, were not what an emperor typically wished to hear. Unrolling the papyrus, I found myself reading a formal petition from the Senate, filled with complaints about my philosophical inclinations, criticisms of my military spending, and barely concealed demands that I govern more like my predecessors, and less like a student of Stoic virtue. My first impulse was familiar and entirely human: anger at their ingratitude, frustration with their short-sightedness, and a burning desire to summon them immediately and explain precisely why their perspective was wrong. Here I was, dedicating my life to their welfare and the empire's good, and they responded with petty political maneuvering and demands that I abandon the very principles that guided my decisions. But as I set the scroll aside and closed my eyes, I remembered a fundamental teaching that had taken me years to truly internalize. Other people will act according to their own nature, their own understanding, and their own interests, regardless of my preferences about how they should behave. The senators were not failing to be the people I wanted them to be. They were simply being exactly who they were. This realization marked the beginning of my education in perhaps the most difficult form of letting go, releasing our attachment to controlling other people's choices, opinions, and behaviors. As emperor, I wielded enormous influence over others' actions through law, reward, and punishment. But I was learning that true power lay not in forcing compliance, but in accepting that even absolute authority cannot reach into another person's mind and compel them to think, feel, or choose differently. The Senate's petition became my teacher, in a lesson I would need to relearn countless times throughout my reign. I could control what information I provided to the senators, how clearly I explained my reasoning, and how respectfully I treated their concerns. But I could not control whether they would understand my explanations, agree with my logic, or respond. To respect with respect in return, this principle extended far beyond politics into every relationship in my life. I wanted my wife Faustina to share my passion for philosophy, but she found my books tedious and preferred the social gatherings I considered frivolous. I wanted my son Commodus to embrace the responsibilities of future leadership, but he was drawn to gladiatorial games and the approval of crowds, rather than the quiet work of governance. I wanted my closest advisors to always offer wise counsel, but they sometimes gave advice colored by their own ambitions or limitations. In each case, I faced the same fundamental choice. I could exhaust myself trying to change them into the people I thought they should be, or I could accept them as they were, and focus my energy on my own responses to their choices. The first path led to constant frustration, damaged relationships, and the illusion that their behavior somehow reflected my adequacy as husband, father, or leader. The second path led to peace, authentic connection, and the freedom to influence others through example rather than demand. Learning to release control over others required distinguishing between influence and control. I could influence others through the consistency of my character, the wisdom of my decisions, and the way I treated them, regardless of how they treated me. But I could not control their responses to that influence. Some people would be inspired to examine their own lives more carefully, others would remain unchanged, or even become more resistant to virtue. I practiced responding to criticism without defending myself compulsively, to betrayal without seeking revenge, to misunderstanding without desperate attempts at clarification. This did not mean becoming passive or failing to communicate clearly. It meant communicating my truth while accepting that others might not receive it as I intended, might not value what I valued, or might choose differently than I would choose in their position. The greatest freedom came when I stopped taking other people's behavior personally. When senators criticized my policies, I learned to see their criticism as information about their priorities and perspectives, rather than as attacks on my worth. When advisors gave poor counsel, I could focus on developing better systems for decision-making rather than feeling betrayed by their limitations. When family members disappointed me, I could continue loving them while accepting that love does not guarantee agreement or shared values. This practice transformed my effectiveness as a leader. When I stopped needing others to validate my decisions, I became more willing to make difficult choices based on principle rather than popularity. When I released my attachment to being understood, I became clearer in my communication because I was no longer speaking from defensiveness or desperation. When I accepted that I could not control others' loyalty, I became more worthy of loyalty through the consistency of my own character. During the long winter campaigns along the Danube, I established my headquarters in the fortress of Vindobona, a massive stone structure that had withstood countless barbarian assaults over the decades. Its walls were thick enough to repel any siege engine, its towers high enough to spot approaching enemies from miles away, and its gates strong enough to hold against any army we were likely to face. Yet as I walked those impregnable ramparts, each evening planning the next day's operations and reviewing reports from across the frontier, I reflected on a different kind of fortress, one that no external enemy could ever breach, no political revolution could overturn, and no personal loss could destroy. The Stoics called it the inner citadel, and I was slowly learning to build and inhabit this unconquerable refuge of the soul. The inner citadel is not a place but a practice, not a destination but a way of being that recognizes the fundamental distinction between what can touch us and what we truly are. External events, victories and defeats, praise and criticism, health and illness, gain and loss may affect our circumstances, but they cannot reach the core of our being unless we grant them permission to do so. I had begun to understand this principle intellectually through my study of Epictetus, but it was during those bitter months on the frontier that I learned to inhabit it practically. The Germanic tribes had launched a coordinated assault across multiple points of our defenses, stretching our forces thin and creating a cascade of military and logistical challenges that would have overwhelmed me in earlier years. Reports arrived daily of setbacks that in my younger days as emperor would have sent me into spirals of anxiety and self-doubt. A supply convoy had been ambushed, leaving 2 cohorts without adequate provisions. A trusted general had made a tactical error that cost us strategic ground. Disease was spreading through one of our camps, weakening our effective fighting strength. Each piece of news represented a problem that required immediate attention and could potentially lead to larger disasters. But rather than allowing these external challenges to disturb my inner equilibrium, I practiced retreating to the citadel. I would remind myself that these events, however significant, were happening to my empire, my armies, and my responsibilities. They were not happening to the essential part of me that observed, evaluated, and chose how to respond. This distinction was not mere philosophical hair-splitting, but a practical tool for maintaining the clarity of mind necessary for effective leadership. When I identified completely with external circumstances, my emotional state fluctuated wildly with each new report. Success made me overconfident. Failure made me doubt my abilities. Criticism made me defensive. Praise made me prideful. This emotional volatility clouded my judgment and made me reactive rather than responsive. The inner citadel provided a stable observation post from which I could witness these external events without being overwhelmed by them. I could acknowledge the genuine challenges they represented while maintaining the inner calm necessary to address them skillfully. The setbacks were real, but they did not define my worth as a person or my capacity to learn and adapt. From this inner fortress, I could see that my essential self, the part of me that made choices, held values, and committed to virtue, remained untouched by external circumstances. My reputation might suffer, but my character was my own responsibility. My body might weaken, but my mind could remain strong. My plans might fail, but my integrity could remain intact. This practice required constant cultivation. The mind's natural tendency is to merge with whatever it experiences, to identify completely with our roles, our relationships, and our circumstances. Each day brought opportunities to practice distinguishing between what was happening to me and who I was beneath what was happening. When barbarian raids threatened our supply lines, I would acknowledge the military challenge while remembering that my worth as a person did not depend on perfect strategic outcomes. When advisors brought news of political unrest in Rome, I would address the practical issues while maintaining inner peace about matters beyond my direct control. When personal letters brought word of family troubles, I would respond with appropriate care while not allowing external concerns to destabilize my inner equilibrium. The inner citadel became my refuge, not from responsibility, but for responsibility. By maintaining a stable inner core, I could engage more effectively with external challenges. By refusing to let circumstances determine my emotional state, I could make better decisions based on wisdom rather than reactivity. By remembering that my true self was deeper than my circumstances, I could face both success and failure with equal composure. This fortress of the soul required no stone walls because it was built from understanding rather than materials. It needed no guards because it was protected by wisdom rather than weapons. It could never be conquered because it existed in the one realm where I had absolute sovereignty. My own capacity to choose my response to whatever life might bring. The dispatch from Syria should never have been written. In my haste to address reports of rebellion in the eastern provinces, I had ordered a military response that proved not only unnecessary, but counterproductive. The alleged rebel leader was actually a loyal governor whose messages had been delayed by poor weather and my precipitous action had insulted a faithful servant of Rome while wasting resources we could ill afford. When the truth became clear, I ordered the dispatch burned, watching the papyrus curl and blacken in the brazier flames. But no fire could erase the mistake itself, and no imperial authority could command the past to be different than it was. For days afterward, I found myself replaying the decision, imagining how I might have gathered better information, consulted more advisors, or simply waited for confirmation before acting. This mental rehearsal of past errors had become an exhausting habit. Whether reviewing political misjudgments, military miscalculations, or personal failures as husband and father, I would spend hours refighting battles that were already lost, remaking decisions that had already been made, and torturing myself with alternative histories where my wisdom had been perfect and my choices flawless. The irony was not lost on me. Here I was, studying and teaching the philosophy of letting go, yet I remained utterly attached to mistakes I could no longer change. I could release my grip on future outcomes with increasing skill, but the past seemed to hold me with chains I could not break. Every regret was a form of mental imprisonment, a refusal to accept that what had happened had indeed happened exactly as it did. Through careful examination of this pattern, I began to understand that attachment to past mistakes was actually a disguised form of pride. When I berated myself for poor decisions, I was implicitly claiming that I should have been perfect, that someone of my intelligence and training should never make errors of judgment. My self-criticism was really a demand that reality conform to my image of myself as an infallible leader. But this demand was as futile as expecting the sun to rise in the west. Human beings make mistakes, not occasionally but regularly, because we make decisions with incomplete information under pressure and with the inevitable limitations of our perspective and understanding. Expecting myself to be exempt from this universal condition was not high standards, but unrealistic fantasy. Epictetus had taught that we suffer not from events, but from our judgments about events. This principle applied as much to past events as to present ones. The Syrian dispatch incident was neither good nor bad in itself. It was simply what had happened. My suffering came from my judgment that it should not have happened, that a competent emperor would have avoided it, that this mistake somehow diminished my worth as a person and a leader. I began practicing a different response to past errors. Instead of asking, "How could I have been so foolish?" I would ask, "What can this mistake teach me?" Instead of demanding, "This should never have happened," I would observe, "This is exactly what happened, and now I can learn from it." Instead of concluding, "I am inadequate," I would recognize I am human, and humans learn through experience, including the experience of making mistakes. This shift in perspective transformed regret from a source of suffering into a source of wisdom. The Syrian incident taught me valuable lessons about the importance of verification, the dangers of hasty action, and the need for better communication systems across the empire. These lessons would help me make better decisions in the future, but only if I could extract the wisdom without remaining trapped in self-recrimination about the past. I learned to distinguish between appropriate regret and destructive rumination. Appropriate regret involved acknowledging my mistakes, taking responsibility for their consequences, making amends where possible, and extracting lessons that would improve my future judgment. Destructive rumination involved endless replay of what had gone wrong, fantasy scenarios about how things might have been different, and shame that served no constructive purpose. The practice of self-forgiveness became essential to this process. Not self-forgiveness in the sense of making excuses or minimizing the real consequences of my errors, but self-forgiveness in the sense of accepting that I was a learning being rather than a perfect one. I could acknowledge my mistakes fully, while refusing to let them define my essential worth or paralyze my future effectiveness. This approach required releasing attachment to an impossible standard of flawless performance. I had to accept that being a good emperor meant making the best decisions I could with available information, learning from mistakes when they occurred, and improving my judgment over time. It did not mean never making errors, never disappointing anyone, or never facing the consequences of imperfect choices. Through letting go of past mistakes, I discovered that the energy I had been wasting on futile self-criticism could be redirected toward present responsibilities and future improvement. The past became a teacher rather than a tormentor, a source of wisdom rather than a prison of regret. In the Forum stands a statue of Julius Caesar, carved from the finest Carrara marble, by the most skilled sculptors of his age. It was erected to commemorate his victories, to immortalize his greatness, and to inspire future generations with his example. Yet when I passed it yesterday, I noticed what the builders never intended. The slow but inexorable work of time etched into every surface. Weather has softened the sharp lines of his features. Rain has stained the white marble with subtle discolorations. The inscription at its base, once crisp and bold, has been worn smooth by countless hands touching the stone. Even this monument to permanence, this attempt to freeze greatness in stone, bears witness to the universal truth that everything in existence is subject to change, decay, and eventual dissolution. Standing before that weathered statue, I reflected on my own attempts to create lasting achievements. I had built roads that would crumble, established laws that future emperors would revise, and won victories that time would render meaningless. Even the empire itself, vast and seemingly eternal, was merely one temporary arrangement of power that would eventually give way to new forms of human organization. This recognition of impermanence had initially filled me with something approaching despair. If everything I worked to build would eventually fall apart, if everyone I loved would die, if even my memory would fade from human consciousness, what was the point of effort, care, or commitment? Why strive for excellence if excellence itself was temporary? Why love deeply if love was destined to end in loss? But through patient contemplation and daily practice, I began to understand that impermanence was not the enemy of meaning, but its very foundation. It was precisely because things were temporary that they deserved our care and attention. The fleeting nature of beauty made it more precious, not less. The limited time we had with loved ones made our relationships more valuable, not worthless. Learn to see impermanence as a teacher rather than a tormentor. It taught me to pay attention to what was happening now rather than taking it for granted. When I truly accepted that my reign would end, I became more focused on governing well today rather than obsessing over my historical legacy. When I embraced the temporary nature of my relationships, I became more present with family and friends rather than assuming there would always be time later for deeper connection. The practice of observing impermanence became a daily discipline. Each morning, I would look at familiar objects around me, the scrolls on my desk, the furniture in my chambers, the clothes I wore, and remind myself that all of these things were in the process of change, moving inevitably from creation through use toward eventual dissolution. This was not morbid dwelling on destruction, but realistic appreciation of the natural cycle that governs all existence. I extended this observation to my own body and mind. My physical strength was already not what it had been in youth, and it would continue to decline regardless of my preferences. My memory, once sharp and reliable, had begun to show the subtle changes that come with age. Even my thoughts and emotions were in constant flux, arising and passing away like clouds in an ever-changing sky. Rather than fighting these changes or pretending they were not happening, I practiced accepting them as natural expressions of the impermanence that defines all life. My aging body was not failing me. It was simply following the same laws that governed everything from flowers to empires. My changing mind was not deteriorating. It was participating in the universal flow of transformation that made growth and learning possible. This acceptance of impermanence transformed my relationship with both success and failure. Military victories became occasions for gratitude rather than pride, because I understood they were temporary achievements in an ongoing struggle. Political setbacks became learning opportunities rather than personal catastrophes, because I knew they too would pass and be replaced by new challenges. I found profound freedom in releasing my attachment to permanent outcomes. When I stopped demanding that my achievements last forever, I could pour my energy into doing excellent work without the anxiety that comes from needing every effort to produce lasting results. When I accepted that all relationships would eventually end in separation, I could love more fully without the desperate clinging that destroys intimacy. The impermanence of all things taught me to work with the flow of change rather than against it. Instead of exhausting myself trying to preserve what was inevitably passing away, I could focus on responding skillfully to whatever was emerging. Instead of mourning the loss of past arrangements, I could remain open to new possibilities that change made available. Through embracing impermanence, I discovered that the peace I sought was not found in achieving permanent security, an impossible goal, but in developing the inner stability to remain centered regardless of external changes. The statue of Caesar would continue to erode, the empire would eventually transform or fall, and my own life would reach its natural conclusion. But the practice of virtue, the cultivation of wisdom, and the commitment to love could flourish within the context of universal impermanence, finding their meaning not in lasting forever, but in being fully expressed in each passing moment. The letter arrived without ceremony, slipped into my morning correspondence as though it were routine administrative business, but the words it contained cut deeper than any barbarian sword. You call yourself a philosopher, Emperor, but your campaigns have brought nothing but death to our sons. Your Stoic virtue is a mask for vanity, your wisdom mere intellectual pride. History will remember you not as Marcus the Wise, but as Marcus the Hypocrite. The author had not signed his name. Cowardice, I thought initially, before recognizing the irony. Here I was, supposedly a student of philosophy, reacting to anonymous criticism with exactly the kind of wounded pride that the letter accused me of harboring. The unknown writer had struck precisely at my most vulnerable point, my attachment, to being seen as both a successful ruler and a genuine philosopher. For hours after reading those harsh words, I found myself mentally composing responses that would demonstrate the writer's unfairness, explaining the difficult circumstances that had necessitated military action, defending the sincerity of my philosophical commitments. I imagined writing a treatise that would vindicate my reputation for all time, proving beyond doubt that my critics were wrong and my approach was correct. But as the initial sting of wounded pride began to fade, I recognized this reaction as another form of attachment that was causing me unnecessary suffering. I was clinging to others' opinions about me as though my worth as a person depended on universal approval. I was demanding that everyone understand and appreciate my motivations, as though being misunderstood were a form of injustice rather than an inevitable part of human existence. The letter became my teacher in a lesson I desperately needed to learn: how to release attachment to reputation and glory without becoming indifferent to the effects of my actions on others. This proved far more difficult than I had anticipated because reputation and recognition had been intertwined with my sense of identity since childhood. As a young man destined for imperial responsibilities, I had been taught that legacy mattered, that the opinions of others were measures of success, that history's judgment would determine the ultimate value of my life's work. These beliefs had driven me to work hard, to seek excellence, and to care about the consequences of my decisions. But they had also created a form of slavery to external validation that undermined the very inner freedom that philosophy was supposed to provide. I began to distinguish between acting virtuously and acting to be seen as virtuous. When I made Decisions based on what would enhance my reputation as a philosopher-emperor. I was not actually practicing philosophy, but performing it for an audience. True virtue meant doing what was right, regardless of whether anyone would notice, appreciate, or remember. This distinction became practical when I faced difficult choices about resource allocation during a particularly harsh winter on the frontier. My advisors recommended reducing support for barbarian refugees who had sought protection within our borders, arguing that Roman citizens should take priority and that helping enemies would be seen as weakness. My inclination was to maintain support for the refugees because they were human beings in need, but I was acutely aware that this decision would be criticized as impractical idealism. The old me would have been paralyzed by concern about how different choices would affect my reputation. Would helping the refugees make me appear weak? Would prioritizing Roman citizens make me seem heartless? Would splitting the difference satisfy anyone? But I realized that these questions were irrelevant to the actual moral issue at hand. What response would best serve human welfare and express genuine virtue? I chose to maintain support for the refugees while also taking additional measures to ensure Roman citizens' needs were met. Some criticized this as naive, others praised it as compassionate, but I found that I could receive both criticism and praise with equal equanimity because I had made the decision based on principle rather than anticipated reactions. Learning to release attachment to reputation required accepting that I would be misunderstood, criticized, and sometimes condemned regardless of my actual motivations or the wisdom of my choices. Some people would always see my philosophical interests as pretentious. Others would view my military actions as contradictory to Stoic principles. These judgments said more about the observer's perspectives than about my character, and trying to control them was as futile as trying to control the weather. I practiced receiving criticism as information rather than attack, praise as encouragement rather than validation. When someone accused me of hypocrisy, I would examine whether there was truth in the charge that could help me improve, while not allowing the accusation to define my worth. When others praised my wisdom, I would appreciate their recognition, while remembering that external approval was not the measure of genuine virtue. The freedom that came from releasing attachment to reputation was extraordinary. When I stopped needing others to see me as perfect, I became more willing to admit mistakes and learn from them. When I no longer required universal understanding of my motivations, I could make difficult decisions based solely on what seemed right rather than what would be popular. When I ceased demanding recognition for my efforts, I could work for their own sake rather than for the rewards they might bring. Through this practice, I discovered that true glory was not something that could be given or taken away by others' opinions. It was the inner satisfaction that comes from living according to one's deepest values, regardless of external recognition. The anonymous critic who had wounded my pride had inadvertently freed me from a prison I had not fully realized I was. Onter inhabiting. Each evening when my family gathered for the evening meal, I maintained a practice that my household found peculiar. I would have the servants set one additional place at our table, complete with cup, plate, and utensils, but leave it empty throughout our time together. When guests inquired about the vacant chair, I would explain that it represented someone who was present with us yesterday, but absent today, a reminder of how quickly presence becomes absence, how easily companionship becomes solitude. This empty place served as my daily practice of what the Stoics call negative visualization, deliberately imagining the loss of what we currently possess in order to cultivate genuine appreciation and prepare ourselves emotionally for inevitable changes. The practice might seem morbid to those unfamiliar with its purpose, but I had discovered it to be one of the most powerful tools for developing both gratitude and equanimity. The technique involved spending time each day imagining various forms of loss that could potentially occur: the death of loved ones, the loss of health, political downfall, military defeat, or even simpler deprivations like the loss of a comfortable home or adequate food. This was not pessimistic dwelling on disaster, but realistic preparation for the kinds of changes that define human existence. When I imagined losing my eyesight, I found myself paying closer attention to the visual beauty around me, the play of light on marble columns, the expressions on my children's faces, the changing colors of sunrise over the city. When I contemplated the possibility of losing my hearing, conversations became more precious, and I listened more carefully to the nuances of voice and meaning that I might otherwise miss. The practice was particularly powerful when applied to relationships. When I spent time imagining Faustina's death, our conversations that evening carried a different quality of attention and tenderness. When I contemplated my children's mortality, I became more present during our time together, less distracted by imperial business that would wait but might never have another chance to connect deeply with them. This was not morbid preoccupation, but practical preparation. Since everyone I loved would eventually die, and since some might die unexpectedly soon, it made sense to appreciate them fully while they were present, rather than taking their presence for granted. Negative visualization helped me love more completely by removing the illusion of guaranteed permanence that often diminishes our attention to current blessings. The technique also served as training for actual loss when it occurred. During the plague years, when death took advisors, friends, and family members with shocking suddenness, I found that my daily practice of imagining such losses had prepared me emotionally to respond with grief but not despair, sadness but not bitterness. I could mourn fully while accepting that loss was part of life, rather than a personal injustice. I extended the practice beyond personal relationships to encompass my role as emperor. I would imagine losing political support, facing military defeats, or even being overthrown by rivals. Rather than increasing my anxiety about these possibilities, this practice helped me appreciate my current position while holding it lightly. I could work diligently to govern well without becoming desperately attached to remaining in power. Negative visualization taught me to distinguish between appropriate concern and futile worry. Appropriate concern involved taking reasonable precautions, making good decisions, and caring for my responsibilities. Futile worry involved obsessing over outcomes beyond my control or becoming paralyzed by fear of potential losses. The practice helped me prepare for difficulties without living in constant anxiety about them. The empty chair at dinner served as a daily reminder that everything I currently enjoyed was temporary and therefore precious. My children's laughter, my wife's companionship, my advisor's counsel, my own health and mental clarity, all of these were gifts of the present moment that could change or end without warning. This awareness did not diminish my enjoyment, but intensified it by removing the complacency that comes from assuming permanence. I discovered that negative visualization was actually a form of positive practice. It generated greater appreciation, deeper presence, and more resilient responses to actual difficulties when they arose. By regularly contemplating loss, I became more grateful for what I had. By imagining setbacks, I became more focused on making good use of current opportunities. By preparing emotionally for endings, I became more capable of new beginnings. The practice required balance and wisdom in its application. Too little negative visualization led to complacency and shock when difficulties inevitably arose. Too much became paralyzing pessimism that prevented effective action in the present. The goal was realistic preparation, not constant dread. Through this daily discipline, I learned that the fear of loss was often worse than loss itself. When I faced actual setbacks after having imagined them regularly, they were rarely as devastating as my untrained mind might have expected. The practice had built resilience that made me capable of responding to real challenges with composure rather than panic, acceptance rather than resistance. The evidence arrived on my desk in the form of carefully preserved betting tablets and witness testimonies that painted an unmistakable picture of corruption. The gladiatorial games I had sponsored to celebrate our recent military victories had been rigged from the beginning. Wealthy senators had bribed trainers to ensure predetermined outcomes, while the crowd cheered for contests they believed were honest displays of skill and courage. As I reviewed the documentation, my initial response was a familiar surge of anger and disgust. Here was clear injustice occurring under my own authority, wealthy elites exploiting the trust of common citizens for their personal gain. My first instinct was to order immediate arrests, public trials, and severe punishments that would demonstrate the consequences of corrupting public entertainments. But as I set the documents aside and reflected on my reaction, I recognized an opportunity to practice one of the most difficult aspects of the Stoic discipline, accepting that injustice exists without allowing it to poison my own character with bitterness, revenge, or the desperate need to right every wrong. This was not the first time I had encountered corruption within my administration, nor would it be the last. Throughout my reign, I had discovered advisors selling access to imperial audiences, generals awarding contracts to family members regardless of merit, and governors enriching themselves at their province's expense. Each revelation had triggered the same cycle of outrage, punishment, and futile hope that harsh consequences would somehow eliminate human venality from the empire. I was beginning to understand that expecting perfect justice in human affairs was as unrealistic as expecting perfect weather or perfect health. People would sometimes act selfishly, dishonestly, and harmfully, not because the system was broken, but because human nature included these tendencies alongside capacity for virtue. My peace of mind could not depend on eliminating all unfairness from the world, because such elimination was impossible. This realization did not mean becoming passive about injustice or abandoning my responsibilities as emperor. I still ordered investigations into the rigged games, still held the guilty parties accountable, and still implemented reforms designed to prevent similar corruption. But I learned to undertake these actions from a place of calm responsibility rather than reactive anger. The difference was profound. When I responded to injustice from anger, my decisions were often hasty, excessive, or counterproductive. I would overpunish some offenders while missing others, create new rules that generated new forms of corruption, or become so focused on punishment that I neglected prevention. Anger made me reactive rather than strategic, emotional rather than effective. When I responded from acceptance of injustice as an inevitable part of human existence, I could address specific instances of corruption while maintaining perspective about the larger patterns. I could implement consequences without expecting them to transform human nature. I could work for improvement while accepting that improvement would be gradual, partial, and always subject to new forms of breakdown. This practice required distinguishing between accepting that injustice occurs and accepting specific instances of injustice without response. I was not called to become indifferent to wrongdoing, but to respond to it without allowing it to disturb my inner equilibrium. The goal was to act from virtue rather than from the emotional turbulence that injustice naturally provokes. I learned to see corruption and betrayal as information about the people involved, rather than as personal attacks on my authority or judgment. When senators rigged gladiatorial games, this revealed their character and priorities, but it did not reflect on my adequacy as emperor unless I failed to address it appropriately. When advisors proved dishonest, this showed their limitations, but it did not mean I was foolish for having trusted them initially. The most difficult aspect of this practice involved releasing attachment to outcomes in my efforts to promote justice. I could establish policies, create oversight mechanisms, and punish wrongdoing, but I could not guarantee that these measures would eliminate all future corruption. Some people would always find ways to exploit systems for personal advantage, regardless of how carefully I designed safeguards. Accepting this limitation freed me to focus on what was actually within my control. My own commitment to virtue, the consistency of my responses to wrongdoing, and the example I set through my own behavior. I could not make everyone honest, but I could be honest myself. I could not eliminate all injustice, but I could ensure that injustice did not make me unjust. Through practicing this discipline, I discovered that accepting injustice without bitterness actually increased my effectiveness in addressing it. When I was not emotionally invested in perfect outcomes, I could think more clearly about practical solutions. When I was not driven by anger about corruption, I could focus on prevention rather than just punishment. When I accepted that some unfairness was inevitable, I could appreciate and build upon the justice that did exist. The rigged gladiatorial games became a teacher rather than just a problem. They reminded me that my role was not to eliminate all wrongdoing from the empire, but to respond to wrongdoing with wisdom, consistency, and commitment to virtue. The corrupt senators had acted according to their nature. My task was to act according to mine. The bronze sundial in my private garden had been crafted by the finest artisans in Alexandria, its gnomon precisely calibrated to track the sun's movement across the Roman sky. Yet this morning I found it broken, its shadow-casting arm snapped off during the night storm, and lying in fragments among the herbs and flowers my gardeners tended so carefully. As I knelt to gather the broken pieces, I reflected on the irony of this accident. Here was an instrument designed to measure time, now rendered timeless by its destruction. The sundial could no longer tell me whether it was the 3rd hour or the 6th, could no longer track the passage of minutes and hours that usually structured my daily routine. In its brokenness, it had become a teacher of something more valuable than chronology, the art of inhabiting the present moment fully. Most of my suffering, I had begun to realize, occurred not in the present, but in my mental journeys to past regrets or future anxieties. When I was physically present in my study reviewing reports, my mind might be relitigating yesterday's diplomatic failures or rehearsing tomorrow's military challenges. When I was spending time with my family, my thoughts often drifted to political concerns that would require attention later or personal mistakes that continued to trouble me. This fragmentation of attention meant that I was rarely fully present for my actual experience. I was missing the texture of the present moment, the quality of morning light, the expression on an advisor's face during crucial conversations, the fleeting emotions that moved across my children's features as they shared their daily experiences. I was living a step removed from my own life, always mentally elsewhere, even when my body was engaged in important activities. The broken sundial became my reminder to practice what I came to think of as temporal letting go, releasing attachment to past and future in favor of complete presence to what was actually happening now. This was not about abandoning all planning or memory, both of which were necessary for effective leadership. It was about recognizing that the only moment in which I could actually live, choose, or act was the current one. I began each day with a practice of present moment anchoring. Before reviewing the night's dispatches or meeting with advisors, I would spend time simply observing what was immediately available to my senses, the feel of morning air on my skin, the sounds of the city awakening beyond my windows, the taste of the simple breakfast I ate each dawn. This practice helped establish a foundation of presence that I could return to throughout the day's demands. During meetings and audiences, I practiced giving my complete attention to whoever was speaking, rather than preparing my responses or thinking about the next item on my schedule. I discovered that this quality of presence not only made me a better listener, but actually improved my decision-making. When I was fully attentive to current information, I could respond more skillfully than when my mind was divided between present input and mental rehearsal of future actions. The practice extended to moments of physical discomfort and emotional difficulty. When joint pain from old campaign injuries flared during long sessions of standing audiences, instead of mentally fleeing to thoughts of when the pain might end, I would practice accepting the sensation as part of my current experience. When criticism from advisors triggered defensive reactions, instead of immediately planning counter-arguments, I would notice the emotional response and choose my reply from awareness rather than reactivity. I learned that present moment awareness was not a state to achieve, but a practice to return to repeatedly. The mind's natural tendency was to wander into memory and anticipation, and this wandering was not a failure, but simply the mind's normal operation. The skill lay not in preventing mental time travel, but in noticing when it was happening and gently returning attention to immediate experience. This practice transformed my relationship with both pleasant and unpleasant experiences. When I was fully present for moments of beauty, sunset over the Palatine Hill, my daughter's laughter. During our evening walks, the satisfaction of a problem solved through careful reasoning, these experiences became more vivid and memorable. When I was fully present for moments of difficulty, tense negotiations with hostile ambassadors, reports of military setbacks, the physical discomfort of illness, these experiences became more manageable because I was not amplifying them with mental commentary about how they should be different. The broken sundial taught me that time was not the enemy of presence, but its medium. Each moment offered the opportunity for complete engagement with life, as it was actually unfolding, rather than as I thought it should unfold. Past and future existed only as mental constructs. Reality existed only in the present moment, where I could actually perceive, choose, and act. Through cultivating present moment awareness, I discovered that most of my anxieties about the future were based on incomplete information and imaginary scenarios, while most of my regrets about the past involved demanding that what had happened should have happened differently. Neither mental activity served any useful purpose, and both distracted me from the immediate opportunities for wisdom, virtue, and effectiveness that were always available in the present moment. The sundial remained broken in my garden, but its brokenness had become more instructive than its function. It reminded me daily that the only time that mattered was now, the only place I could live was here, and the only moment in which I could practice virtue was this one, the decree I signed. That morning represented a decision that would cost the imperial treasury significantly while providing me no personal benefit whatsoever. New grain distributions for the city's poorest residents, expanded medical care for military veterans, and additional funding for provincial schools. Each line item reduced resources available for the palace improvements my architects had proposed, and the military spectacles that enhanced imperial prestige. As I set down my stylus after signing the document, I reflected on how this allocation of resources represented something deeper than fiscal policy. It embodied a fundamental discovery about the relationship between self-concern and inner freedom that had transformed my understanding of leadership and life itself. For years, I had operated from an assumption that seemed both natural and reasonable, that my primary responsibility was to protect and advance my own interests, and that service to others was valuable primarily when it also served my goals. This approach had created a constant internal tension between what I wanted for myself and what duty demanded for the empire, between personal preferences and public responsibilities. But through practicing the Stoic discipline of letting go, I had begun to understand that this apparent conflict was based on a false premise. The assumption that my welfare was separate from others' welfare, that my happiness depended on outcomes that benefited me personally, was not only incorrect, but was actually the source of much of my internal conflict and suffering. The grain distribution provided a concrete example of this principle in action. When I approached the decision from self-centered concern, I could see only what the expenditure would cost me, fewer resources for projects that would enhance my comfort and prestige, But when I approached it from a perspective of service to the common good, I could see what the expenditure would accomplish: reduced hunger, improved health, and greater stability throughout the city. More surprisingly, I discovered that acting from service rather than self-interest actually increased my own sense of satisfaction and peace. When I allocated resources for the palace improvements, the pleasure was temporary and soon replaced by anxiety about whether the improvements were adequate, whether they projected the right image, and what additional enhancements might be needed. When I allocated resources for grain distribution, the satisfaction was deeper and more lasting, because it connected me to something larger than my personal preferences. This pattern repeated across every area of imperial responsibility. When I made military decisions based on what would enhance my reputation as a great general, I was constantly anxious about outcomes beyond my control and never satisfied with any level of success. When I made military decisions based on what would best protect Roman citizens and maintain just peace, I could act with confidence and accept whatever results followed from my best efforts. The paradox was remarkable. The more I focused on serving others rather than advancing my own interests, the more genuine satisfaction I experienced. This was not because service guaranteed better outcomes. Sometimes decisions made for the common good produced personal costs or public criticism. Rather, it was because service aligned my actions with my deepest values and connected me to purposes larger than my temporary circumstances and desires. I began to understand that letting go through service worked by dissolving the artificial boundary between self and others that created so much internal conflict. When I truly committed to the welfare of all Roman citizens, their flourishing became my flourishing. When I genuinely cared about the empire's long-term stability, its success became more important than my personal legacy. When I sincerely wanted what was best for my family, their happiness mattered more than their compliance with my preferences. This shift in perspective required releasing attachment to recognition and reward for my service. When I served in order to be appreciated, I was not actually serving, but rather using service as a strategy for gaining approval. True service meant acting for others' benefit, regardless of whether they understood, appreciated, or reciprocated my efforts. The practice demanded constant vigilance against the subtle ways that self-concern could disguise itself as service. When I provided grain distributions to enhance my popularity with the masses, I was serving my own political interests rather than their genuine needs. When I implemented just policies to be remembered as a just emperor, I was serving my reputation rather than justice itself. The test was whether I would continue the same actions even if no one would ever know or acknowledge my efforts. Through this discipline, I discovered that service was not something I did in addition to my personal life, but was the foundation of a fulfilling personal life. When I stopped seeing my role as emperor as a burden that interfered with my private happiness, I could find meaning and satisfaction in the daily work of governance. When I stopped resenting the time that leadership demanded, I could appreciate the opportunity to contribute to something significant and lasting. The grain distribution decree represented more than social policy. It embodied a way of being that dissolved the artificial separation between duty and desire, between service to others and service to my deepest self. Through letting go of narrow self-interest, I had found a form of self-fulfillment that no personal achievement could provide. Through serving the common good, I had discovered my own greatest good. The imperial treasury ledgers spread across. My desk told a sobering story of resource allocation and fiscal responsibility. Each line item represented a choice about where to invest the empire's finite wealth: military preparedness, infrastructure maintenance, social programs, administrative efficiency. No decision existed in isolation. Every aureus spent on one priority was an aureus unavailable for another need. As I reviewed these financial accounts, I reflected on a parallel form of accounting that received far less systematic attention, but was equally crucial to effective leadership: the economics of emotional energy. Just as the empire's gold reserves were limited and required careful stewardship, my capacity for concern, worry, enthusiasm, and mental effort was finite and demanded strategic allocation. I had spent years exhausting myself emotionally on matters beyond my control while neglecting areas where my psychological investment could actually make a difference. I would lie awake worrying about barbarian movements I could only respond to, not prevent, while giving insufficient attention to administrative reforms within my direct authority. I would spend emotional energy resenting advisors' limitations while underinvesting in the patient work of developing better systems for decision-making. This realization led me to approach emotional expenditure with the same strategic thinking I applied to fiscal management. I began asking myself, where am I investing my worry, and what return am I receiving? Which concerns deserve my full attention because I can influence their outcomes, and which are draining my energy without productive result? The practice required developing what I came to think of as an emotional audit, a regular examination of where my mental and emotional resources were being allocated. I discovered that much of my psychological energy was being wasted on three unproductive categories: rehashing past events I could not change, worrying about future scenarios I could not control, and attempting to manage other people's thoughts and behaviors. Each of these categories represented a form of emotional investment that consistently produced negative returns. Replaying past mistakes consumed mental energy that could be used for present decision-making while providing no practical benefit since the past was fixed. Worrying about hypothetical future problems drained current effectiveness while rarely improving actual preparedness. Trying to control others' reactions exhausted my influence while typically making them more resistant to the genuine leadership I could provide. I began practicing what I called strategic emotional withdrawal, deliberately reducing investment in these unproductive areas and redirecting that energy toward more promising applications. Instead of spending mental effort on whether senators appreciated my philosophical interests, I could focus on developing policies that would benefit the empire, regardless of political opinion. Instead of worrying about potential Germanic raids, I could concentrate on improving our intelligence gathering and response capabilities. This reallocation required the same discipline needed for fiscal restraint. Just as it was tempting to fund every worthy project regardless of budgetary limitations, it was natural to care about every possible concern regardless of my capacity to address them effectively. Both impulses led to overextension and reduced effectiveness across all priorities. I developed practical techniques for managing emotional expenditure. When I noticed myself beginning to worry about something, I would ask, is this concern within my sphere of control? Can my worry contribute to a better outcome? If the answer was no, I would practice redirecting that energy toward areas where it could make a genuine difference. This did not mean becoming callous or indifferent to matters beyond my control. When plague struck distant provinces, I could feel appropriate concern for the suffering involved while focusing my active attention on relief efforts within my authority. When barbarian tribes threatened our borders, I could acknowledge the genuine danger while concentrating my energy on practical defensive measures rather than anxious speculation about their intentions. The economic model helped me understand why some people seem to accomplish more with less apparent effort, while others exhausted themselves with constant activity but limited results. The difference often lay not in total energy expenditure, but in allocation efficiency. Those who invested their emotional resources strategically could sustain high performance in areas where it mattered most, while those who scattered their attention across too many concerns often achieved less in any single area. I learned to recognize the warning signs of emotional overspending, feeling constantly overwhelmed despite making progress on important tasks, becoming reactive rather than responsive to daily challenges, losing perspective about which problems were truly urgent versus merely attention-grabbing. These symptoms indicated that I was trying to care about more things than my psychological resources could support effectively. Through practicing emotional economics, I discovered that limitation was not the enemy of effectiveness, but its foundation. By accepting that I could not care equally about everything, I became capable of caring more deeply about the things that truly mattered. By acknowledging that my concern was finite, I could invest it more wisely. By releasing attachment to unlimited emotional engagement, I found the focus necessary for sustained, excellent performance. The treasury ledgers remained balanced through careful attention to income and expenditure, assets and liabilities. My emotional accounts required the same kind of systematic stewardship, the same strategic thinking about where investment would yield the greatest return for the empire and for my own capacity to serve effectively over time. The physician's diagnosis was delivered with the careful precision that medical men use when bearing unwelcome news to emperors. The persistent cough that had troubled me through the winter campaigns, the fatigue that no amount of rest seemed to remedy, the gradual weight loss that my servants tried to conceal with looser-fitting robes, all pointed to the same inevitable conclusion that my body had been trying to communicate for months. "How long?" I asked, setting aside the scrolls I had been reviewing, as though they still mattered for my future planning. "Perhaps months, Caesar, possibly a year, if the gods are merciful." As the physician withdrew, leaving me alone with this ultimate news, I experienced something unexpected. Not terror or despair, but a profound sense of clarity. All the philosophical preparation, all the daily practices of letting go, all the meditations on impermanence had been leading to this moment when theory would become reality, and I would discover whether my Stoic training had been mere intellectual exercise or genuine preparation for life's final test. Death, I realized, was the ultimate teacher of letting go, because it demanded release of everything we typically cling to: our plans, our relationships, our identity, our very existence. No amount of imperial power, philosophical wisdom, or personal virtue could negotiate with mortality. Here was the one force that was completely beyond human control, the final examination of whether I had truly learned to accept what could not be changed. In the days following the diagnosis, I found myself applying every principle I had developed through years of Stoic practice. I observed my attachments with new clarity, my concern for the empire's future, my love for my family, my hope that my philosophical writings might benefit others, my very basic attachment to consciousness itself. Each represented a form of clinging that death would inevitably sever. Yet rather than increasing my suffering, this recognition brought unexpected peace. I could love my wife and children completely while accepting that our relationships had always been temporary. I could care deeply about the empire's welfare while acknowledging that my stewardship had always been limited in duration. I could value my philosophical insights while releasing attachment to how they might be received or remembered. The practice of negative visualization, which I had used for years to cultivate gratitude and prepare for loss, now revealed its deepest purpose. I had spent countless evenings imagining the deaths of loved ones, the loss of power, the failure of my projects. Now I was called to imagine and accept my own non-existence with the same equanimity I had tried to bring to other forms of loss. This final letting go required confronting the most fundamental attachment of all, the attachment to being rather than not being. Every cell in my body, every instinct developed over decades of survival, every natural human impulse protested against accepting non-existence. Yet I found that the same principles that had helped me release smaller attachments could be applied to this ultimate detachment. I began to see death not as an enemy to be fought, but as a completion to be accepted. My life had been a temporary arrangement of experiences, relationships, and accomplishments that had emerged from nothing and would return to nothing. This was not tragic but natural, the same pattern that governed everything from flowers to empires. I was not being singled out for unfair treatment, but was participating in the universal process that made change and renewal possible. The preparation involved practical as well as philosophical elements. I completed arrangements for succession, wrote final letters to those I loved, and ensured that my personal philosophical writings would be preserved for anyone who might benefit from them. But the deeper preparation involved releasing attachment to these very arrangements succeeding according to my preferences. I could prepare carefully for the empire's future leadership while accepting that my successors might govern differently than I would have chosen. I could express my love and wisdom to family members while releasing attachment to how they might receive or apply my final counsel. I could arrange for my writings to be preserved while accepting that they might be ignored, misunderstood, or forgotten. Through this process, I discovered that preparing for death was not about dying well, but about living well until the moment of death. Each day became an opportunity to practice complete presence, full engagement, and genuine virtue without the distraction of assuming unlimited future time. When I truly accepted that any day might be my last, every conversation became more meaningful, every decision carried more weight, and every moment of consciousness became more precious. The ultimate test of letting go was not whether I could release my grip on life gracefully, but whether I could live fully while knowing that life was ending. Death preparation revealed that the peace I sought had never depended on avoiding mortality, but on accepting it completely while making the best possible use of whatever time remained. My physician's report had given me what every person receives, but few acknowledge, advance notice, that life is temporary and therefore infinitely valuable. The emperor who had once believed his power could control outcomes was learning that true power lay in accepting what could not be controlled while responding with wisdom to what remained within his influence until the very end. The scroll I was writing for my son Commodus contained the most important lessons I would ever attempt to teach, yet I was acutely aware that teaching itself represented the ultimate exercise in letting go. I could offer wisdom, share experiences, and provide guidance, but I could not control whether he would understand, accept, or apply anything I had learned through decades of philosophical practice and imperial responsibility. The art of ruling, I wrote, is not the art of controlling outcomes, but the art of responding wisely to whatever outcomes arise. You will face challenges I cannot imagine, make decisions I cannot guide, and bear responsibilities that will be yours alone. Each word carried the weight of my love for him and my acceptance that his path would necessarily be different from mine. This tension between caring deeply about someone's development and releasing attachment to their choices had become one of my most profound teachers. As emperor, I was responsible for the development of countless individuals, military officers, provincial governors, senators, advisors. As father, I felt even more intensely the desire to share what I had learned about virtue, wisdom, and inner peace. Yet every attempt to teach had shown me that genuine learning could not be forced, only invited. I had made the mistake in earlier years of believing that my insights about Stoic philosophy were so valuable that others should naturally want to embrace them. When advisors resisted my suggestions about emotional discipline, when senators seemed indifferent to my teachings about virtue, when even family members appeared unmoved by principles that had transformed my own experience, I would feel frustrated and disappointed. This frustration was itself a form of attachment to others, learning what I thought they should learn, changing in ways I thought they should change, benefiting from wisdom I thought they should value. I was trying to control their inner development the same way I had once tried to control external circumstances, and the result was the same: suffering when reality failed to conform to my preferences. The breakthrough came when I began applying the fundamental Stoic distinction between what is up to us and what is not up to us to the realm of teaching and influence. What was up to me was the quality of example I set, the clarity with which I communicated principles, the consistency with which I embodied the virtues I espoused, and the love and respect I showed regardless of others' responses. What was not up to me was whether anyone would be inspired by my example, understand my communication, or choose to adopt similar practices. This realization transformed my approach to mentoring Commodus. Instead of anxiously monitoring his progress and becoming frustrated when he showed more interest in gladiatorial combat than philosophical contemplation, I could focus on being the kind of person whose character might inspire him when he was ready for inspiration. Instead of demanding that he appreciate lessons that had been meaningful to me, I could trust that life would provide him with his own teachers and challenges. I learned to distinguish between attachment to outcomes and commitment to effort. I remained deeply committed to providing the best guidance I could offer, to modeling virtue as consistently as possible, and to creating opportunities for others to encounter Stoic principles if they chose to explore them. But I released attachment to their responses, their timeline for growth, or their ultimate choices about how to live. This approach proved more effective than my earlier attempts at direct persuasion. When I stopped needing others to validate my philosophical insights by adopting them, my communication became clearer and less defensive. When I ceased being invested in immediate results, I could plant seeds of wisdom without demanding that they sprout according to my schedule. When I accepted that each person must find their own path to virtue, I could support their journey without trying to determine its direction. The practice extended beyond formal teaching to every interaction where I hoped to influence others positively. With military officers, I could demonstrate courage and strategic thinking, while accepting that some would develop these qualities and others would not. With citizens, I could model justice and compassion while releasing attachment to their becoming more just or compassionate themselves. Perhaps the most difficult aspect of this discipline involved my own legacy and the long-term impact of my philosophical work. I had spent years writing meditations and reflections that I hoped might benefit others, developing practices that had brought me great peace and effectiveness. Yet I had to accept that these writings might be lost, misunderstood, or simply ignored by future generations. The test was whether I would continue this work even if I knew with certainty that no one would ever read it, understand it, or benefit from it. If my writing was truly an expression of virtue rather than a strategy for influence, then its value lay in the writing itself rather than in its reception. If my teaching was genuinely motivated by love rather than by attachment to results, then it could continue regardless of visible outcomes. Through this practice, I discovered that letting go of others' spiritual progress paradoxically increased my effectiveness as a teacher and mentor. When I was not anxiously invested in their development, people felt more freedom to explore ideas and practices at their own pace. When I was not defensive about my philosophical positions, others could engage with them more openly. When I trusted the process of growth rather than trying to force it, natural learning could occur more readily. The scroll for Commodus became both my final teaching and my final exercise in letting go. I poured into it everything I had learned about virtue, wisdom, and inner peace, while accepting completely that he might choose to ignore it all. My love for him and my hope for his flourishing remained unchanged, but they were no longer dependent on his becoming the person I thought he should be. As I write these final words, the physicians have withdrawn from my chamber, and the familiar sounds of the palace, urgent footsteps in corridors, muffled conversations of advisers, the distant trumpet calls that mark the changing of the guard, continue around me as they have for nearly 2 decades of my reign. Yet everything has changed because I have finally, completely let go. The irony is profound. In my youth, I feared that releasing attachment would diminish my capacity to care, to lead, to love. I worried that Stoic detachment would make me indifferent to the empire's welfare, cold toward my family, passive in the face of injustice. Instead, I have discovered that letting go has amplified every virtue I sought to cultivate and dissolved every source of unnecessary suffering I had unconsciously embraced. Looking back across the years of learning this art, I see that each lesson in letting go was actually a lesson in living more fully. When I released my desperate need to control outcomes, I became more effective at influencing what was actually within my power. When I stopped clinging to others' approval, I became worthier of genuine respect. When I accepted impermanence, each moment became more precious rather than less meaningful. The empire will continue after I am gone, guided by new hands and shaped by circumstances I cannot foresee. My family will grieve my passing and then continue their own journeys of growth and discovery. The philosophical insights that have brought me such peace may benefit others or may be forgotten entirely. All of this is as it should be, part of the natural flow of change that makes renewal and progress possible. I think of the young man who first received the imperial purple, overwhelmed by responsibilities he felt unprepared to handle, anxious about living up to others' expectations, desperate to prove himself worthy of the position fate had granted him. That emperor existed, ruled as well as he could, and then learned to disappear into something larger than personal ambition or fear. The greatest discovery has been that the peace I sought was not something to be achieved, but something to be uncovered. By removing the obstacles I had placed in its path, every attachment that I released, every demand that reality be different than it was, every attempt to control what could not be controlled, these had been barriers to the tranquility that was always available in the present moment. To you who read these words in whatever time and place you find yourself, I offer this final teaching. The art of letting go is not about caring less, but about caring more skillfully. It is not about becoming passive, but about directing your finite energy toward the areas where it can actually make a difference. It is not about accepting injustice, but about responding to injustice without allowing it to corrupt your own character. You will face losses I cannot imagine, of loved ones, of dreams, of certainties you thought were permanent. You will encounter setbacks that challenge your deepest beliefs about fairness and meaning. You will be criticized for decisions made with the best information available, misunderstood despite your clearest communication, and sometimes betrayed by those you trust. Most, in each of these experiences, you will have the same choice I faced countless times. You can exhaust yourself fighting what has already happened and demanding that reality conform to your preferences, or you can accept what is while focusing your energy on your response to what is. The first path leads to bitterness, anxiety, and the illusion of struggling against forces beyond your control. The second path leads to peace, effectiveness, and the freedom that comes from mastering what is actually within your power. The Stoic art of letting go is not a philosophy for those who want to withdraw from life, but for those who want to engage with life fully without being destroyed by its inevitable challenges. It is not wisdom for the weak, but for those strong enough to acknowledge their limitations while acting with courage within those limitations. Start where you are. Begin with small attachments, your need for perfect outcomes in daily tasks, your frustration when others don't meet your expectations, your anxiety about events beyond your influence. Practice the discipline of desire by preferring what happens rather than demanding that what you prefer should happen. Use negative visualization to cultivate gratitude for what you have, while preparing emotionally for what you might lose. Build your inner citadel through daily meditation on what is truly up to you and what is not. Remember that your thoughts, your choices, and your character are your domain, while everything else, including your reputation, your health, Others' behavior, and even your own future, lies beyond your direct control. This is not cause for despair but for profound relief, because it means your peace and virtue depend only on areas where you have actual sovereignty. When you face criticism, loss, or failure, ask yourself, how can this situation help me practice virtue? What is this experience teaching me about letting go? How can I respond in a way that honors my deepest values regardless of the outcome? These questions will transform every challenge into an opportunity for growth and every setback into a teacher of wisdom. Do not expect to master these practices quickly or completely. I have spent decades learning to let go, and even now, at the end of my life, I discover new layers of attachment that I had not previously recognized. The path is gradual, requiring patience with yourself and persistence in daily practice. What matters is not perfect detachment, but consistent effort to hold life's gifts and burdens with an open hand. Remember that letting go is not a one-time achievement, but a moment-by-moment choice. Each interaction, each challenge, each success and failure offers a new opportunity to practice this art. The emperor's duties and your own responsibilities may differ, but the fundamental human challenge remains the same: how to care deeply while clinging lightly, how to act decisively while accepting uncertainty, how to love fully while embracing impermanence. As my own impermanence approaches its completion, I find not sadness but gratitude for the opportunity to have learned these lessons, to have served something larger than myself, and to have discovered that the peace we seek is not found by avoiding life's difficulties, but by meeting them with wisdom, courage, and an open heart. The art of letting go is the art of being fully human while touching something eternal. Practice it faithfully, and you will find, as I have found, that in releasing your grip on what you cannot control, you discover a strength and freedom that no external circumstance can ever take away. This is my final gift to you, the knowledge that you already possess everything you need for peace, virtue, and genuine happiness. You need only remove the barriers you have placed between yourself and these treasures through the gentle, persistent practice of letting go.